Somewhere in the southern highlands of Appalachia, tucked into the folds of the Blue Ridge and the Smokies, there are family names that have stood for 200 years. Names carved into church pewbacks and county deed books and the weathered faces of limestone grave markers half swallowed by kudzu. The Hannons were one of those families. Scotch-Irish, everyone said. Frontier stock, Presbyterian and proud of it. The kind of people who crossed the Atlantic with nothing and carved a life out of mountain hardwood and red clay and sheer stubborn will. That was the story. It was told at kitchen tables and passed through generations like a piece of furniture too heavy to move. It was the story in the family Bible. It was the story the grandparents told, and the story the grandchildren repeated without question. The problem is that the story was wrong, not slightly wrong, not wrong around the edges. Wrong in the way that changes everything. The kind of wrong that only becomes visible when someone finally runs the DNA. And when a Hannon descendant did exactly that, what came back from the laboratory was not the expected confirmation of Scotch-Irish ancestry. What came back was something older, stranger, and more remarkable than anything the family had been told. A hidden identity, buried for 2 centuries beneath a name and a story that had been carefully constructed to conceal it. This is what the DNA found, and this is why it was hidden in the first place. For as long as anyone in the family could remember, the Hannons was Scotch-Irish. That was the foundation. That was the bedrock underneath everything else, the religion, the politics, the sense of who they were and where they stood in the world. Scotch-Irish meant something specific in Appalachia. It meant Presbyterian churches on hilltops and fiddle music on Saturday nights, and a particular brand of pride that did not bend easily and did not apologize for itself. It meant ancestors who had come over from Ulster in the 18th century, part of the great wave of Scots-Irish immigration that had poured through Philadelphia and down the Great Wagon Road into the Carolina and Virginia backcountry, filling up the hollows and the ridge lines with people who wanted land and distance from authority in roughly equal measure. The Hannons fit that template perfectly. The surname itself read as Irish. The geography was right. The religion was right. The oral tradition was consistent across generations. Nobody questioned it because nobody had reason to. In the 19th century, if your neighbors called you Scotch-Irish and your church records said Protestant, and your skin was light enough to pass without comment, you were Scotch-Irish. That was how identity worked in the Southern Highlands. It was not a genetic designation. It was a social one, a thing confirmed by community consensus rather than documentary evidence. And community consensus, it turns out, can be maintained for a very long time when everyone involved has an interest in maintaining it. The Hannons built their lives on that consensus. They farmed their land, raised their children, buried their dead in the mountain churchyards, and passed the Scotch-Irish story forward intact. For 200 years, nobody looked underneath it. Nobody thought there was anything underneath it worth finding. The DNA said otherwise. There is a reason the southern highlands of Appalachia became one of the best places in North America to disappear. Not disappear in the sense of dying. Disappear in the sense of becoming someone else entirely, of shedding one identity and wearing another until the new one calcified into fact. The mountains made it possible. The geography of the southern Appalachians is not simply rugged. It is isolating in a way that lowland people have always underestimated. The ridges run parallel to each other for hundreds of miles, broken by narrow creek hollows that dead-end against cliff faces, connected to the outside world by paths that were treacherous in summer and impassable in winter. A family that settled in one of those hollows in 1780 could live for 3 generations without sustained contact with anyone outside their immediate community. No census taker reached them regularly. No circuit preacher knew their full history. No county clerk had records going back far enough to ask uncomfortable questions. In that kind of isolation, the story you told about yourself was the story that stuck. And the story you told about yourself was almost always the story that protected you. Because in the 18th and 19th century American South, identity was not merely a matter of pride. It was a matter of survival. The legal and social architecture of the antebellum South sorted human beings into categories with brutal precision. And the category you occupied determined what you could own, who you could marry, whether your children could attend school, whether you could testify in court, whether you were a person in the eyes of the law at all. Families who carried ancestry that placed them outside the acceptable categories had every rational incentive to construct a new story, to reach for the nearest respectable identity and hold onto it with both hands. The mountains gave them the privacy to do it. The isolation gave them the time to make it permanent. And 2 centuries later, a DNA test gave their descendants the first honest look at what had actually been hidden there. They were called Melungeons. It was not a name most of them chose for themselves, and for most of American history, it was not a name anyone wanted attached to their family. It appeared in court records and census documents and travelers' accounts from the early 19th century, always applied from the outside, always carrying a weight of suspicion and contempt. A Melungeon family in 1830 Tennessee or 1850 Virginia occupied a social position that defied the clean categories the law preferred. They were not white enough to claim full legal protection. They were not black enough to be enslaved. They were not recognized as Native American by any official designation that carried rights or standing. They existed in a gap between the categories, and the gap was not a comfortable place to live. The origin of the Melungeons themselves is one of the most contested questions in Appalachian history, and the debate over where they came from ran for nearly 2 centuries on oral tradition and speculation alone, until DNA stepped in and began to settle it. What the genetic studies found, confirmed across multiple independent research projects in the 2000s and 2010s, was that the Melungeon communities of the Southern Highlands carried a specific and consistent ancestral mixture, Sub-Saharan African lineages, present but often deeply buried, Native American ancestry from the Cherokee, the Powhatan, the Lumbee, and a European component that was not straightforwardly British or Irish, but carried signals pointing toward the Iberian Peninsula and the Eastern Mediterranean. Portuguese sailors, freed Africans, indigenous survivors of early colonial contact, all converging in the mountain hollows of Virginia and Tennessee and the Carolinas over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, intermarrying across generations until the mixture became its own community with its own culture and its own desperate need to pass as something the law would tolerate. For families like the Hannons, Melungeon ancestry was not a heritage to celebrate, it was a liability to conceal, and they concealed it with extraordinary effectiveness for 200 years. The DNA result does not arrive without warning if you know how to read the paper trail. The documents were always there. The discrepancies were always visible to anyone willing to look at them without the Scotch-Irish story already fixed in their mind as the answer. Census records from the mid-19th century are where researchers usually begin, and the Hannon family records follow a pattern that genealogists who specialize in Melungeon ancestry recognize immediately. The racial designation in the earliest available census entries is inconsistent in a way that purely Scotch-Irish families almost never show. A head of household listed as white in 1840, whose neighbors are listed with different designations. A surname that clusters geographically, not with the Ulster Presbyterian communities of the Shenandoah Valley, but with the ridgeline settlements of Newman's Ridge and Blackwater Creek in Tennessee and the Clinch Mountain. Communities of southwestern Virginia, the precise geographic heartland of documented Melungeon settlement. Church records complicate the picture further. The Presbyterian affiliation that anchored the Scotch-Irish identity is present, but it appears later than it should. Earlier generations show gaps, periods where the family does not appear in any church register at all, which, in a community where religious affiliation was the primary social infrastructure, is itself a signal. Families without a church were families without a legible identity, and families without a legible identity in the antebellum South were families who had something to protect. The surname clustering is perhaps the most telling detail of all. The Hannon name appears repeatedly in the same county records, alongside surnames that researchers have long identified as Melungeon family names. Collins, Gibson, Goines, Bolin. These are not random Scotch-Irish neighbors. These are the core surnames of the Melungeon community, documented across generations in the same hollows and on the same ridgelines. A family does not build its social world exclusively among Melungeon families for 3 generations by accident. The paper trail was pointing somewhere specific the entire time. The DNA simply confirmed the destination. Before I show you the last part, if you've ever looked at your own results and wondered where Melungeon ancestry fits into your bloodline, I put it all together in a guide called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is in the description. But stay right here, because what comes next is the part most people completely miss. The test itself is straightforward. A swab, a laboratory, a few weeks of waiting, and then a results page that either confirms what you always believed or dismantles it entirely. For the Hannon descendant who submitted the sample, the results page did the second thing, not gently, not ambiguously. The ancestral breakdown that came back from the laboratory did not show the expected profile of someone with deep Scotch-Irish roots. It showed something more complicated, more layered, and more precisely diagnostic than a simple European percentage. The first signal was Sub-Saharan African ancestry, present at a level too significant to be a distant anomaly, sitting in the results at a percentage consistent with an ancestor 2 to 4 generations back who carried it in full. In a family that had identified as white and Scotch-Irish for 2 centuries, that signal alone was enough to rewrite the story. But it was not alone. Alongside the African ancestry sat a Native American component, small but clear, the kind of percentage that genetic genealogists associate with a Cherokee or Powhatan ancestor 3 to 5 generations removed. Exactly the time frame that would place that ancestor in the early settlement period of the Southern Highlands, and then the European component, which was itself not what the Scotch-Irish story predicted. Instead of the clean Northwestern European signature of Ulster Presbyterian families, the European ancestry showed an admixture pointing toward the Iberian Peninsula. Portuguese and broadly Southern European signals sitting alongside the British Isles percentage in a ratio that matched, with remarkable precision, the genetic profile that independent researchers had documented across multiple Melungeon family lines in peer-reviewed studies published between 2010 and 2015. 3 signals: African, Native American, Iberian inflected European, each one explainable on its own by some alternative story. Together, in that specific combination, in those specific proportions, pointing at one community and one community only. The Melungeon signature is not a guess, it is a pattern, and the Hannon results matched it exactly. To understand where those 3 signals came from, you have to go back further than the mountain hollows, further than the census records, and the church gaps, and the ridgeline communities of Newman's Ridge. You have to go back to the 16th century, to the earliest period of European contact with the North American coastline, when the boundaries between peoples were not yet fixed, and the categories that would later harden into law were still fluid enough for something genuinely new to emerge. The Portuguese connection is the oldest thread. Portuguese sailors and explorers were moving along the Atlantic coastline of North America decades before English settlement became permanent, and the documentary record contains scattered but persistent evidence of Portuguese and Spanish individuals, some of them of mixed African and Iberian ancestry themselves, who remained behind when their ships departed, absorbed into coastal and near-coastal Native American communities along the Carolina and Virginia shore. These were not colonizers in any organized sense. They were individuals, stranded or deliberately left, or simply choosing to stay, who married into the communities that took them in, and whose descendants carried a genetic signature that was neither fully European nor fully Native American, but something blended from both. The African component arrived through a different door. The earliest Africans in the Virginia and Carolina colonies were not universally enslaved in the way the later plantation system would define. In the first decades of the 17th century, a small number of Africans arrived as indentured servants, completed their terms, and became free landowners in the colonial backcountry. Some of them married into the mixed communities already forming along the Piedmont and the mountain foothills. Their descendants carried that African ancestry forward into the highland communities that would eventually be called Melungeon. Three streams: Portuguese and broadly Iberian, Native American, free African colonial, converging across the 16th and 17th centuries in the Carolina and Virginia backcountry, moving gradually uphill into the mountain hollows as lowland society hardened its racial categories and made the valleys inhospitable. The Hannons descended from that convergence. Their DNA is its biological record. The identity was not lost. That is the thing that has to be said clearly before anything else. The Hannons did not lose their Melungeon ancestry the way you lose a document or forget a date. They buried it. Deliberately, carefully, and for reasons that made complete rational sense given the world they were living in. In the antebellum South, Melungeon ancestry carried legal consequences. Tennessee and Virginia both passed legislation in the 19th century that restricted the rights of free people of color, a category that Melungeon families fell into or risked falling into, depending on how a county clerk or a hostile neighbor chose to interpret their appearance. The right to vote, the right to own property without challenge, the right to have a legal marriage recognized by the state, the right to send your children to the county school, all of it contingent on which side of the color line a family was assigned to. Families who could pass chose to pass. Families who could construct a plausible Scotch-Irish identity and sustain it across enough generations to make it unchallengeable did exactly that. It was not cowardice. It was strategy. It was the entirely rational decision of people who understood the system they were living inside and protected their children from it the only way available to them. What the DNA restores to Hannon descendants today is not something that was taken from them. It is something their own ancestors chose to set aside so that the family could survive. And survival worked. The family survived. The children went to school. The property was not seized. The marriages were recognized. The strategy succeeded completely, so completely that 2 centuries later the descendants had no idea the strategy had ever been necessary. What they have now, with the results in hand, is the full picture. Not the Scotch-Irish story alone. Not the Melungeon identity alone. Both together, the buried truth and the constructed survival, which is itself a more honest account of what Appalachian families actually were than the clean single origin stories that got passed down in their place. Somewhere in Polk County, North Carolina, tourists check into a bed and breakfast without knowing what ground they are standing on. They admire the mountains and the river, and the particular quality of the light in the southern highlands in the late afternoon. And they do not know that the families who built this place carried identities layered like the geology of the hills themselves, one stratum concealed beneath another for 2 centuries. The Hannon descendants who now hold their DNA results are standing at the end of a very long story. A story that began in the 16th century with a Portuguese sailor on a Carolina shoreline with a freed African landowner in the Virginia backcountry, with a Cherokee ancestor on a mountain ridge who married into a community that had no clean name and no legal protection and no choice but to build one from scratch. The Hannons were never simply Scotch-Irish. They were something older and more complicated, and in every meaningful sense, more interesting than the story that was handed down. And now, for the first time in 200 years, the family has the evidence to say so. The DNA did not create this identity. It recovered it. It reached back through the census records and the church gaps and the deliberate forgetting and found what had always been there, waiting in the bones, patient as the mountains themselves. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.